Would you be startled to know that a child, perhaps your child, could actually get through 12 years of schooling without really being able to read? Do the arguments and the controversies among educators themselves about teaching reading confuse you? Well, in just a moment, we're going to show you how a linguistic approach to reading instruction may help solve the problem of why Johnny can't read. On our last program, we talked about writing systems. We talked about the development of the alphabet. And particularly, we talked about the English writing system, which we found was alphabetic in principle. That is, it was based on a phonemic principle of one sound, ultimately of one sound, one phoneme, one symbol, one letter. But we've also found, of course, that there were other kinds of things in this English writing system of ours, that actually we wrote morphemes at times. We drew pictures of words and endings, so to speak, somewhat like the Chinese. That there was, in a very real sense, inconsistency and incompleteness, as we've shown before in this series of programs, in our writing and in our spelling system. But again, 2 points. Language is prior to writing, and our English writing system is primarily phonemic. It is primarily an alphabetic system. Now, this is a program about reading. And there is a problem about reading in our schools today. Perhaps you're a parent that's been concerned about this. In other words, we don't believe that we are teaching our children how to read well enough and how to read efficiently enough. Now, the linguist feels that he can contribute to the solution of this problem. He feels that his particular knowledge of the structure of language on the one hand and the structure of writing on the other, how linguistic systems and writing systems interrelate, that this specialized knowledge can be of help in the solution of the reading problem. Now, I'm afraid that, as so often happens in American life, there is a controversy that's raging about this whole matter of reading. And like Americans generally, we sort of like to choose up sides, and we see 2 sides of the question, oppositions, dichotomies here. Now, as a linguist, I am not going to take sides in any controversy. What is this controversy? How can we refer to it? Well, I suppose the best way to refer to it is that there's, on the one hand, the phonics people, and on the other hand, the word method people. And as we go on in this program, I'm going to try to show you what the phonics method is, generally, and what the word method is, and how they're the same, and how they're different, and what they are in disagreement about. But as again, I'm not going to take sides myself, and also, I want to say this, right at the outset. I personally believe, and many linguists agree with me, that there has been tremendous progress made in our schools in the teaching of reading in the last 30 years. In other words, what we are going to suggest is perhaps that as linguists we can add something to the particular set of approaches and solutions to this reading problem which may be able to help solve the problem, may be able to teach Johnny to read quicker and better. Now, to begin with, the linguist, as we've said on this program, knows and is convinced that language is prior to writing. Writing is a derived and secondary symbol system, and language comes first. Now, the linguist would look at the reading specialist and many of our educators and disagree right at the beginning on one very important point. And that particular important point, again, has to do with the purpose and the nature of reading. In other words, most of our educators define reading as getting meaning from the printed page. In other words, what they are saying, in effect, is this, that what you do is to go directly from the written word to meaning. Now, the linguist would say, on the other hand, that the written word lets us go to language, of which it is a symbolization, and then we go to meaning. Educators will oftentimes put it this way, They say that the written word is merely a trigger to release a meaning we already possess. The linguist would put it this way, recognizing the priority of language. He would say the written word is a trigger that releases the oral counterpart of the word, which in turn releases the meaning we already possess. This is an essential difference of point of view. And again, it's a question of realizing that language has to be there before we get meaning. There must be some subvocalization, in other words. Now, as I said before, the linguist believes that he can make his contribution because of his understanding of the structure of language and the structure of the writing system. Now, in order to show you how the linguist can, perhaps, make this contribution, we have to review again something about the nature of this alphabetic, primarily alphabetic writing system which we have. It is an obvious fact to all of us, for instance, that this writing system is incomplete and inconsistent, that we do spell our words irregularly. But this is the primary fact, I think, at this point, that 85%, well, perhaps that's not an actual statistic, but I would say approximately 85% of our words are regularly spelled. Alphabetic principle, phoneme, symbol, 85%. 15% are irregularly spelled, but the problem is those 15% occur about 85% of the time. Therein lies the rub. Well, let's look at this regularity part first. Here we have the symbolization of simple vowel phonemes, the a, e, I, or o, and the Now notice that these particular simple or short vowel phonemes are represented over and over again regularly by the single letter A, E, I, O, U, as in at or pat, pet, kit, hop, and cut. One consonant, simple vowel, regular representation, one phoneme, one symbol. Now, in terms of two-syllable words, for instance, again, a patterned regular relationship. Here again, the letters A, E, I, O, U stand for those same simple vowel phonemes, as in pit, pat, pet, foot, pot. And notice what happens here. Two consonant letters now with a Y, all the way down, two consonant letters and a Y, gives us this unstressed business as in fatty, petty, kitty, hoppy, tuggy. By the same token, two consonant letters and ER gives us this this unstressed syllable, the barred IR actually in phonemics. Fatter, better, dinner, copper, butter. A regular kind of pattern. Now, not only in the simple vowels, but also in our so-called long vowels, or complex nuclei, as we've called them earlier. Notice here, the combination A, E, I, O, and U. These are the typical long vowels, or some of the typical, most frequently occurring long vowel, or complex nuclei. Remember, we only have 5 little O letters, A, E, I, O, U, to represent these 36 possible nuclei that we've talked about. Notice, here the letter A with one consonant letter and the so-called silent E gives us a pattern that tells us now this A stands not for A, but stands for the A sound. As the teacher used to say in school, the sound of its own name, letter A. So we get ate, Pete, kite, hope, and cute. One consonant and the silent E. Also, there's several other regular ways. I'm only picking out just a few of the very regular ways in which these things are done. Here, the oo sound, as in O-O, as in moon. Of course, O-O also is used to represent the short vowel phoneme, as in look. This, obviously, is one of the things we have to be careful about. I, this thing, as in the single letter Y, as in try. Notice also that I sound is represented by the IGH business in night, and this is regular. Night, sight, light, right. Here would be a whole series of patterned irregulars, if you will. In other words, this system of writing is a system and is patterned too. A, AY as in day. OY, OY sound, OY writing. AW as in ow, also represented both regularly by OW and OU. Very, very frequent, about 50% of the time. In other words, we have here patterning in a spelling system. Definitely patterned. Now, in terms of this kind of thing that I've just talked about, I think we have to remember that we are not going ever to teach a child to read, we linguists say, unless we realize that alphabetic principle, unless we realize there is a patterned relationship between phoneme and letter. This is the mechanics of reading, which must be in the totally in the awareness of the person who is teaching our child how to read. Without the realization of the alphabetic principle that underlies this whole thing, the child will not learn to read in any sense of the word. Now, to the linguist, oftentimes the educator, well, I would say that the linguist cannot agree with the educator on this particular point. We linguists get the impression that the educator feels that because the child can't read when he comes to school, that he doesn't know his language. Now, as we pointed out on this series, the child is in full control of the structure of that language when he's 5.5 years old or 6. That is, the patterns from the sounds right on up through the sentences he has internalized. Now, just because he doesn't know how to write his language or read his language doesn't mean he doesn't know his language. But if the educator is confused as to the nature of language and writing, thinking of writing being prior and language not, then he gets the idea if the child can't read, he doesn't know his language. And I have seen this thing borne out over and over again, and particularly in what are called the reading readiness programs. I have seen children go into schools and act my own among them, and actually be treated as though they had to learn their language. They had to not only learn their language, but they had to also learn to see things on a printed page, to discriminate objects. Now, I think some children, probably those that particularly have eye trouble, and lots of reading problems come from physiological defects. I'm talking only about the normals on this program. They look at a printed page, and they look at some pictures, and they're supposed to be able to discriminate this shape from that. Well, I suppose this is a good training for kids. Some kids maybe need it a little bit more than others. It seems to be the way kids look at television these days, particularly television commercials. Their visual perception is very well sharpened. But the thing that worries me is that I actually saw a thing not very long ago, a reading readiness exercise, in which here were 3 children standing. The tree was up there, and they were looking up in the tree, and along the side of this thing, it had a picture of a squirrel and a picture of a pig. And of course, this was called a meaning clue. Which would be the more likely to be up the tree, the squirrel or the pig? And the child was supposed to designate the fact the squirrel would be more likely to be up the tree. I don't know what this does, but it's somehow or other, the reading readiness people feel this kind of thing is necessary. I think they waste a great deal of time. I believe the child is highly motivated, ready to read when he comes to school. And that if the teachers knew the difference between language and writing, if they understood something about dialect variations, if they understood something about correctness, I believe that they would see that they have wasted a lot of time that they needn't to waste. I can remember not very long ago, as a matter of fact, I was in a classroom. And in this particular classroom, the teacher was really concerned about whether the child could read or not, because that particular child had a different dialect from the teacher. The problem was the word which and the word which. Well, in my dialect, they sound exactly alike, and so did they in the child's. Here they are. You know, which as in which one, said the teacher, and which, the thing that rides on the broomstick at Halloween. Okay, now this child had the same kind of dialect patterning here as I did. The child made no distinction. Which one? Which. But the teacher, coming from a northern Middle Western pattern, did regularly make a distinction between which, putting an H in front of that W, which as in which one versus which. Now, because the child didn't do it, the teacher thought the child's auditory perception of the language was deficient. And she was trying to get this kid to say which, and the kid was rebelling. Frankly, I would too, because this kid knew perfectly well that that wasn't necessary in his dialect, although he couldn't argue with the teacher, well, he wasn't that educated to argue with the teacher. Also, we get this idea of correctness in this whole mess. That is, for instance, as we saw in one of our earlier programs, we had a standard speaker, a Miss Blair from Dallas, Texas, who said "inny, minny, penny." Now, teachers in the South have tried to get standard speakers of English in these areas, about 90 million perhaps, or 80 million speakers, say "inny, minny, penny" instead of "any, many, penny." It's spelled with an E. The teacher feels somehow or other that this is a wrong pronunciation. Maybe the child hasn't gotten enough auditory perception yet, and they try to make them say "any, many, penny" when it's against that particular dialect to say "any, many, penny," and "any, many, penny" has been said that way for years. In other words, there is a confusion as to what the problem really is, I'm afraid, in terms of many of our dear, dedicated people in the primary schools. The linguists would say an understanding of what the nature of language is, what the nature of language in relation to writing, correctness, dialect variations, these kinds of linguistic insights are essential if this problem is going to be solved. Now, to summarize what we've said so far, the linguist would say that the child has got to be taught the alphabetic principle. The child has got to realize this particular spelling system of ours, irregular as it is still a pattern system that is based on the idea of one symbol one phoneme, one symbol, one sound, one letter. And without this understanding, and until the child gets that understanding, he's not going to learn to read in any sense of the word. Language is prior to writing. We go from the written word to language and then to the meaning in terms of the context of the sentence. Now, at the beginning of the program, I talked to you about this controversy, and I said that we would sum it up under the blanket terms phonics on the one side and word method on the other. Now, the phonics method. Most linguists that I know agree that the phonics method should have been abandoned. And in the last 20 years, it has been used decreasingly in our school system. Now, I'm going to show you, as we go on in describing both of these positions, if you will, these controversial positions, that the linguist actually finds some good in both of them. And we'll see what I mean by that. Again, we're steering a sort of middle course and adding something to this whole business. Now, the old phonics, in the opinion of many linguists, should have been discarded for this reason. In the first place, it is based on a faulty analysis of the relationship between phoneme and letter. That is, the people that were doing this phonics work, and I'm afraid that still are, do not really know the phonemic structure of English in relation to how it's written. Two, they actually handle words, break them up into unrealistic kinds of bits and pieces. And three, and perhaps most important, they assume that all children reaching the school at the age of 5.5 or 6 or 6.5 are equally able to associate now one phoneme with one letter. Now, what we find is that only about 10% of the children seem to be able, when they enter school, to be able to get the idea of one phoneme and one letter. All right, let's now look at a page, a real page, from a phonics primer. This is the first page, and this particular page assumes that the child has gone through a lot of phonetic work on a chart in which he sounds out various kinds or attempts to sound out sound and letter. Then after this particular thing, please notice what it says here in the fine print. It says, if it is impossible to use the phonetic chart, teach the sounds of the following letters. Teach the sounds of the following letters. We've already pointed out on this program that letters don't have sounds. They simply are representing phonemes. So right away, this shows the complete reversal. The cart is pushed in front of the horse in this particular, and also notice this. Look how this word, these monosyllabic words, are broken up. R-A-N, rap-n, rap, rap. I don't know, I suppose you're supposed to do that. Ha-d, ha-m, hat. Obviously, this doesn't exist on sea or land, this kind of breaking up of structure. Second point where this particular kind of method is wrong. And the third, look at the tremendous number of representations of letter in terms of phoneme that we have in this particular page. We know from experience that very few children are able to actually, at this point of page 1, to be able to associate, no matter how much phonetic work, as it's called, they've had before, are able to associate one sound and one letter. So the linguist, or most linguists, would say, yes, the phonics business was not successful and it should have been thrown out. But please remember, the phonics business is based on the alphabetic principle, badly as it's done. And the linguist says without the alphabetic principle, remember, no reading in any sense of the word. Now, let's leave the phonics and go to the word method, the other extreme, if you will, or the other end of the controversy, although there are many shades, of course, in between. Now, what the word method people do is this. They have actually realized, and rightly, as I've just said, in the opinion of many linguists, that the child is not going to be able to tie up sound and letter right away. So what they do is to give the child reading material in which words are put so that they can be distinguished in terms of their configuration. In other words, look looks different to the child as a unit now, as a word unit with spaces before and after than dog. That configuration is going to help the child, when these words are in context, in sentences, separate dog from look. Now, this is a very good point. And also what these word method people do, very sensibly, obviously, is not to include in the child's reading experience words that are not in his vocabulary, in his spoken vocabulary, in his actual experience. So this is all to the good. But what they fail to realize is this, that after the child gets a recognition vocabulary, a sight vocabulary of about 75 words, he on his own begins to realize the alphabetic principle because it's there. He sees that words like fun, run, sun, rhyme. They sound alike. They look alike on the printed page. They differ only in the first letter, and obviously they sound alike except for the first letter. The same thing with go, no, and so. In other words, here the child looks at this and he says, my gosh, there's sense here. But he has probably come up against this joker. He has actually had a word like look presented to him where the O-O stands for the and he's also had boots presented to him where the O-O stands for the oo. And he is thrown back on this business, so well, I guess I was wrong. I guess there isn't much sense to it. I got to go back to this old guessing business through configuration. And so what does he have here? Here he has the word cottage and the word cabbage. I actually saw in a classroom a little girl who said, the farmer went to the cottage when the sentence said the farmer went to the cabbage. He was out in the field, but obviously configuration looks that way. She had no way to attack it. Word attack doesn't come into even the best, what they call word attack. That is something that would be trying to bring the alphabetic principle and structural principles into awareness. It doesn't come until the middle of the second year in most of these word method businesses. By that time, the damage has been done. By that time, this particular kind of relationship which is necessary has been lost sight of. In other words, the linguist says you must introduce words that are spelled consistently. Let that letter U stand only for the sound in button cut and not in put. Let the letter O stand only for ah and aw and not for the sound as it represents here in a word like come. Let me show you now a sample of a primer page that is used right now. Your child and my child are being taught from pages like this. Come, James, come. Come and see the train. See the funny little train. See the train run and puff. Please notice the O letter now is representing the sound. But here the sound is represented by the letter U. Complete inconsistency. Here AI to stand for the complex nucleus in A, as in train. Here the letter A with M and E. In other words, no consistency here. Please also notice the way in which this thing is composed. See the funny little train. Has anybody ever actually heard anybody say, see the funny little train? We say, look at the funny little train. But oh no, not in primerese. In primerese we say, see the funny little train. I wish we could get this kind of primerese out of existence. Also, another thing. Look at these children. These children particularly annoy me. They are so clean, they are so well dressed, they are so nice. They always have unbroken toys, and their mothers look so nice, and their fathers look so nice, and everybody is so happy in this idealized never-never land of the upper middle class that no child that I know can really identify with these particular characters, and yet this is supposed to be something from his real experience. I don't think so. But obviously the thing that I am most concerned about as a linguist is the fact of the inconsistency of the words that are introduced. Now, what is the linguist going to say is the remedy for a thing like this? The linguist would say immediately this. Yes, build on what these people have found out, of course. Let the sight vocabulary come into the kid's awareness, 75 words, before you begin to train him in the alphabetic principles. Yes, but please, says the linguist, let's introduce the words spelled consistently. All one symbol only consistently standing for one sound and one sound only. And then let's see what happens. Now let me show you the kind of a primer page that I would suggest. This is from an actual experimental pre-primer. Second pre-primer. In the first place, the children have gone. We now have animals, and we find that children can readily identify with animals. Also, the picture doesn't tell the whole story. It simply supplements the story, and there is a story. There's a beginning and a middle and an end, not the kind of gibberish that you find in most of these second and third pre-primers that don't really mean anything or tell any real story. But most important of all, there is a consistent relationship between letter and sound. U represents the sound in tuggy, in mud. Everywhere it is, it's representing the sound. The A represents as in tad, etc. Here's the U again for O represents as in pond. Now, and log. There are some items, like this O as in into, and the word the, which have to be, that is the word to and the word the, have to be introduced as special cases very early in the child because they occur so often the child has no difficulty with them. This thing is consistent then. It is consistent. It actually tells a story. Notice down here, in terms of the way in which the language is set together, no see the little boy and so on. Here's actually a contraction. In his sleep, it's his pond. In other words, the contraction is right there. I know of no pre-primer that actually will be that natural. So the linguist would say that he would, in terms of a remedy, he would build on what the word method people have done, and he would obviously use this as an entry into further training in the alphabetic principle as soon as the child has what he needs. Now, again, if the teacher understands linguistics, has some linguistic insights, we are very sure that the teacher will not be concerned about dialect differences. There's really no problem. If this kind of material is used, dialect differences, the teacher has some understanding of correctness, and I believe the child, in fact I know the child, is much more interested in this kind of material than in the other kind of material. In other words, again, alphabetic principle has got to be taught. Alphabetic principle is the most important thing to understand if we are going to teach our children to read. Therefore, our material should point toward the child understanding and getting the alphabetic principle. Consistent spellings. Constantly consistent spellings. Now, to summarize what we've talked about on our program today, we have to remind ourselves again that there is a reading problem. We do actually have a reading problem. This reading problem is one that the American people are concerned about. As I said at the very beginning of the program, great progress has been made in 30 years in the solution of this problem. Of the two opposing camps, phonics and word method, each has something in its favor. What we're suggesting is that the best of each method be put together, but there be added the linguistic ingredient of consistency and understanding of structure of language in terms of structure of writing system. And that this business, the sight vocabulary, be kept, but that it be consistently spelled. I believe that if linguistic insights can be put into the training in the teachers' colleges themselves, into the training of our primary school teachers, that probably 80% of our reading problems would disappear. I firmly believe this. Now, on our program next week, we are going to be talking about meaning. We are going to be talking about meaning in the largest context of communication. We have had to, on this series of programs, so to speak, pull language out to see what language is. But we're going to put language back now and see it as only one, though the most important, but only one of the modes of communication. We're going to see interaction. We're going to see that communication is interaction between people. We're going to see that systematically understanding how this whole business is put together in a package, we can actually understand and maybe contribute to the understanding and evaluation of the psychotherapeutic interview itself. We're going to see many other applications of linguistics. Communication next week. Be with us then, won't you?
This is National Educational Television.